Welcome to our broadcast. I'm Tim Zerichny. Carrie Bartel Christensen and I are co-hosts for this event. As a reminder, the information provided during this event is for information purposes only. For medical questions, please reach out to your primary care or healthcare professional. Now let's begin. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Tim.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you today?
Excellent. You want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Please. Thank you. Carrie Bartel Christensen. I'm Vice President of Real Estate Strategy and Operations for Providence St. Joseph Health. And that is the group that focuses on the built environment. So anything from real estate, design, construction, facility engineering, environmental services, biomedical technologies. We really try to support the healthcare system and the needs of not only our patients, but our employees, and make sure the built environment functions for what we intend it to do. And I focus mostly on the Oregon region and a little bit of Texas. And on the side, my side hustle is working with you a lot to think about housing and what is our responsibility as a large provider of health to engage in housing as we look at all of our different communities. So, cool. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Why, yes, thank you. My name is Tim Zerichny. I'm the Executive Director of Providence Supportive Housing. Providence Supportive Housing in its current iteration has been around since 1985. We are currently 17 housing programs in Washington, Oregon, and California. We are affordable. Most of our units are subsidized, primarily serving low-income elderly, people with disabilities, and people experiencing chronic homelessness. We are on a growth trajectory, to be honest, in addition to serving people with disabilities and seniors and people experiencing chronic homelessness. We're also exploring developing and operating workforce housing, which gets us to the theme of today's conversation. Before we dive into the conversation about workforce, I think it's important to talk about why we as a healthcare organization are talking about housing at all. I know you like to hear me say, so I'll say it. Providence, the Sisters of Providence were founded by Emily Gamelin in Montreal, and her first ministry in 1829 was the Little Yellow House, and she developed permanent supportive housing for the elderly, and then established Houses of Providence throughout the city of Montreal. Subsequently, I like to say that Emily Gamelin knew in 1829 what we're just figuring out today, that housing is absolutely fundamental to health. So, yeah.
I love it. And so it was, I think, in 2019 that Providence kicked off kind of a strategic initiative that we call Housing is Health, and really started to tour, all of our different ministries and markets and understand the state of not only homelessness, but housing instability. And so when we talk about housing instability, we mean people that are rent burdened or housing burdened, meaning they're spending more of their income than really they should to be able to afford, safe housing. And what we learned, I don't think would shock anybody, that all across the United States and the West Coast, people are burdened by housing. And that the cost of housing has not kept up with our wages. It has outpaced. And so many of us could no longer afford to rent a safe place for our families.
Right. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has specific definitions for what that means to be either rent burdened or severely rent burdened. So if you are spending 30% of your income on housing, you are 30% or more, you're considered to be rent burdened. If you're dedicating 50% or more of your income towards housing, then you're considered to be severely housing burdened. And ultimately, we define that, we interpret that as being housing unstable. So these are folks who, through loss of a job, an injury, the onset of disability, an accident,
A car repair.
Yep, could lose their housing easily.
Yep.
So that's important.
That is important. And that kind of brings us to the topic of today. When we first really started to talk about housing, we focused on the poor and the vulnerable first to try to understand how we need to partner for homeless services. And then as we began doing this, we began kind of having this conversation around workforce housing. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about workforce housing. And since it's the topic today, maybe we could just start with what is it and what is it not?
Well, workforce housing it's affordable, and it's affordable to working folks. And again, it is defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as housing designed for households earning 60% area median income up to 120% area median income, or AMI.
So, Tim, what is AMI? We say that word a lot in the housing biz, but a lot of people don't really understand what that is.
We do say that a lot, and it is how especially the affordable housing industry thinks and focuses around questions of preference for housing and eligibility. AMI is actually, it's a really simple measure. It's local, so it's generally specific. It's either a metro area or a county. And it's the midpoint in terms of individual income for a community. So, for example, in Seattle, the area median income is $102,500. So, 50% of all annual income for Seattleites falls under that amount, and 50% falls above that amount. It's the median.
It's the median. And workforce housing is really designated for when we think about who would live in workforce housing. Teachers, police officers, firefighters, nurses, service providers, service workers. It's a broad range, and we generally say it's anybody on from about 60% AMI to 120% AMI is really what workforce housing is designated towards.
Yep. You and I have been talking, and I was specifically talking about or sharing about Santa Clara Unified School District in California. Santa Clara School District actually developed and now peripherally operates what they're calling teacher housing. It was developed on surplus property. And the rents in one of the most pricey markets in the country range from $980 a month to $1,400 a month. So that kind of gives you a sense of, folks are still being asked to contribute rent. It's just not at a fair market rent level. So in comparison, the fair market rent in Seattle right now is $1,600, right?
Wow.
So there's a significant benefit to folks. And as I dug into this story about Santa Clara, there was an interesting sidebar noting that the attrition rate amongst teachers who had this housing benefit was 1/3 of that among teachers who didn't have the benefit. So not only is it certainly a resource around recruitment of talent, and in this case, teachers, it's a powerful tool in terms of resisting attrition and retaining quality talent.
Right. But there is a difference between workforce housing and employer housing. And I think people confuse that sometimes. So this happens to be where Santa Clarita was, very innovative and probably partnered with some local developers or somebody to build housing that would target seniors. But that doesn't mean that it's an employer provided housing option. So these are kind of different things. And sometimes people get confused when we say Providence is interested in workforce housing. That doesn't necessarily mean we're thinking about building a company town.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there are a lot of hazards that come along with the concept of the company town.
Hmm.
You work for us, you live under our roof. All of these get tied together in ways that are really potentially uncomfortable.
Yeah.
There are exceptions to that where, so example, within Providence Supportive Housing, we have positions called night managers, and those
Hmm.
night managers are live-in positions. So their apartments are part of their compensation, and their role is fundamental to being in the unit, being in the building on evenings and weekends. So,
Hmm.
so there are ways that can work, but there's also, sort of fair housing law out there, kind
Yes.
of hovering in the distance. That it was certainly fair housing law was developed in I think it was 1968
Hmm.
uh, to resist discrimination within housing, and we have to
Yep.
think about what that means, that this notion to discriminate. I mean, obviously fair housing law was developed to resist sort of redlining, and particularly resist people of color
Hmm.
being precluded from the housing market. But what we're describing, choosing an employee of a certain organization, that too is discriminating. You're being discriminating by definition.
Right.
So, it's not sort of that employer owned housing idea is not perfect.
Hmm. Hmm. And so workforce housing really is, it's sort of like the communities, what we would hope would be the community's job to solve for. This would be, anybody from multiple different industries, coming together and saying there's just not enough housing that is affordable for people that are making a wide range of salaries, anywhere from, probably 50 to $100,000, depending on the market that you're in. And so, how are we going to solve this? And one of the things that we've been looking at as Providence is, and one of the reasons we're interested in solving it, is our own employees cannot find places to live, affordable places to live, sometimes at all, depending on what market you're in, whether you're in Seward, Alaska, which I know we're both kind of busy thinking about,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Seaside, Oregon.
yeah.
Or sometimes there are lots of apartments available, but none of them are affordable in this range without creating a rent burden for you or your family.
Right, right. And, even in our big markets, you want to talk about Seattle, you want to talk about Los Angeles, you want to talk about, excuse me, Portland, you know, every industry has entry level roles,
Every.
or every industry has roles that are sort of on the lower end of the compensation sort of spectrum, right?
Mhm.
And increasingly, where these markets, or in these markets where the cost of housing has escalated so dramatically, we know our own caregivers are getting pushed further and
Mhm.
further and further away from the places that they work in
Mhm.
order to afford a place to live. And
Mhm.
what we're missing in this calculation is all the time spent traveling,
Mhm.
all the time spent in a vehicle.
Mhm.
I mean, all the greenhouse gases that,
Yeah,
you know,
and just the negative correlation that has to your health.
that's right. That's right. So, this is, it is this sort of creeping issue. Um, the federal government kind of moved out of this space,
Mhm.
this supply side development space, throughout the course of much of the 20th century, to the point that they were kind of they moved to a model of incentivizing
Mhm.
um, demand side development. So, we see that in terms of the housing choice program,
Mhm.
vouchers that you can actually take to the marketplace, or the low income housing tax credit program.
Mhm.
And while those are all fine and well,
Yep.
it's left what we call the missing middle. So
Yes.
it's that workforce, that 60 to 120% development. We don't need to worry about luxury development. That's covered. All the
All day
incentives are
long.
there, right? But it's this quote unquote this missing middle, that's getting short shrift, and really sort of skewing the market,
Mhm.
and contributing to the escalation of these rents and the demand for these apartments.
Yeah. And part of the reason it is missing, and this has just been more acute to me as you and I continue to partner and see, how we can solve some of these tough problems for Providence and for our markets, is because once you make more than 60% AMI, you begin to income qualify out of affordable
Hmm.
housing.
Yep.
And so while, the federal government has taken the stance to incentivize developers to build affordable housing for people under 60% AMI, once you get above there, there's nothing on the market. And the way that workforce housing has to get developed is by putting together an apartment that will make a preferred return for an investor. So once you're above 60% AMI, you're really looking for people that will bring money to build housing and off of a return, right? People invest in real estate because real estate creates returns.
Yep.
And once you're kind of competing for a return, you know, you could add some marble countertops and in-unit laundry
Yeah.
and a gym and all of these things, and you can get a better return by just creating a more luxury apartment that rents more.
Right. Right. And there's a couple forces going on here too, that are all sort of pressing on the market, and it begins with the idea that this is a market, right? That
Yes,
that you know we don't treat housing as a right. You know,
we
we
don't.
treat housing as a phenomena within this sort of neoliberal capitalist environment, right?
Yes.
And that neoliberal capitalist environment generates winners and losers.
Mhm.
And the amongst the losers are folks who are kind of in that lower sort of income range,
Mhm.
that the individuals and families who need that workforce to be successful, and who we need in the jobs that they're in,
We
right?
need them.
Right. They keep the wheels on the bus, literally. Another force that's out there too, go back to the federal government a little bit. you know um, you know the federal contributions to housing have been sort of shrinking, and the focus has been narrowing incrementally now for decades.
Mhm.
And what we saw sort of beginning in the 80s, 90s is the proliferation of chronic homelessness and homelessness, uh, certainly up and down the West Coast, but across the country. And one of the narratives that's being sort of told today is, and some of the action that's being taken is that we're focusing those dollars into chronic homelessness. Like,
Mhm.
we can solve chronic homelessness if we just channel all those resources
Mhm.
to that use, to that purpose. Which I have no. I have no argument with meeting the needs of that population, but
Mhm.
not in a zero sum context. So, not
Correct.
at the expense of workforce,
Yep.
not at the expense of people elsewhere on
Right.
that sort of low income range.
Mhm.
So, that's a problem too. I think we need to resist some of the language of zero sum game,
Mhm.
and not pit one cohort of need against another cohort of
Right.
need.
And when you're
Um,
chronically underbuilt, that's what will happen, right?
right,
Because what we're suffering from is a supply of affordable housing. And so if you funnel all the resources towards, one particular subset of the population, it takes away from the others.
right, right. So, I, I we've been engaged in conversations about workforce development,
Mhm.
and I love that. I think both your position and my position has evolved over time,
They
right?
have.
And actually, our positions have come closer together, I think,
They have.
which is great. So, what are the conditions where it makes sense for Providence to take a serious look at workforce development in any given community, especially considering, sort of what we just talked about, the
Mhm.
expanse of need.
Mhm.
When does Providence have to step out, or when does Providence believe it may need to step out and say, we need to do it?
Yeah. And I think you really alluded to it. It's when we can no longer complete our core function, which is, providing health and providing healthcare, because we can't recruit, we can't retain, we can't have staff that can, work for us and complete these services because there's no place to live. And this is, in the larger cities, they get pushed out and out and out. But in some of the other markets, there are just zero options. And so Providence has decided that it is going to have to take a leadership position in some of these markets and
Mhm.
create the solution where the community maybe isn't necessarily coming together to create it. One of the great things we can do when looking at workforce housing and how to, because what your real goal is to keep the overall cost of the development low. Because once you kind of get up to a certain amount, you still have an investor that's going to want a return on this. So you have to keep the overall cost of development low. So we can look at excess land, we can look at excess buildings, we can look where we have assets that can be repurposed and help lessen the hurdle to be able to at least get land to create a development on.
Yeah.
I would say in a lot of our rural districts and some of our rural hospitals, this is just one of the problems they struggle with every day. Nurses turn down positions because they start looking at the market and they can't find a place to live. And they say, well, that's not an option for me. And so I'll go over here. And so we're, here trying to run a hospital and trying to recruit people to do our core business, but we can't because there's no options in the market to live.
The Urban Land Institute developed a white paper just a year or two ago, whereby they summarized some strategies um, around incentivizing workforce development and really getting at this issue. And you nailed one of those. It really has to do with repurposing underutilized real estate and assets. And
Yep.
and that, and that's not sort of specific to healthcare,
Not
although
at all.
you know, uh, you know, cities, counties, and states are all huge landholders, and
Yep.
land cost and land value is absolutely critical to uh, uh, incentivizing affordable development.
Mhm.
So. Thinking about those resources through the lens of affordability and housing is so very important. Um, Another tool that cities use is inclusionary zoning.
Mhm.
So, inclusionary zoning is a requirement placed on a developer,
Mhm.
a housing developer, a market rate housing developer, to develop a minimum sort of number of affordable units in any given development. Sort of in some cities, alternatively, the developer can just, either donate land or write a check for
Yep.
development elsewhere. What I love about inclusionary units within a building is that you wind up getting a much more integrated community from the perspective of resources.
Economic diversity.
Yep, yep, yep. One of the
Absolutely.
one of the very many valuable diversities that we talk about. Um, we kicked off today talking about a dedicated housing trust fund.
Mhm.
Um, and that's another strategy that ULI identified as a resource to promote workforce development. We mentioned that there is a National Housing Trust Fund, and the National
Mhm.
Housing Trust Fund distributes resources to the states that then distribute those further. But states and counties have also developed their own housing trust funds that,
Mhm.
when coupled with the state and the federal resources, really begin to make a difference. And we're recognizing that in communities where those trust funds do not exist, workforce development, affordable development becomes that much more challenging.
Mhm.
Uh, Go ahead, Carrie.
There's some other things that local governing agencies can do too, and some of that comes in the form of tax exemption.
Mhm.
And so, one of the communities and markets that we're working with, that we shall remain nameless, doesn't have a tax exemption for affordable housing. And so, even when you're trying to clear that debt hurdle, you have to then add in all of the taxes onto that. So, communities can designate for affordable housing, workforce housing, a tax exemption to incentivize people to build.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Urban Land Institute also recommends taking a hard look at code and revising code as appropriate within the cities. Um, you know, this phenomena really sort of dates back to the middle of the 20th century and beforehand, and dates back to some of those redlining activities that
Yes.
were specifically developed to preclude people of color from participating in the housing markets. And
Yes.
one of the ways they did that was to zone huge stretches of cities as single family only. And then, certainly local neighborhoods went even further towards their redlining activities. But,
Mhm.
multifamily is really where it's at. Apartment buildings is really where it's at in terms of, you know, assertively and aggressively addressing this workforce housing challenge.
Yep.
And again, individual cities and counties evaluating and revising code to
Yes.
accommodate more creative development and more
Yep.
integrated development is a great tool.
Clustering, cottage clusters, additional dwelling units, anything you can do to get more density on a piece of land than just one family, one box, one lot, one house.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I see that we're getting short on time.
Yep. Yep. We have a question here pertaining to would this include a large family option, for example, for a family of 13?
Mhm.
Um, in my experience, workforce development uh, sometimes includes, units with multiple bedrooms, but there are typically occupancy standards. And I think realistically, anyone would be hard pressed to identify a workforce unit that could accommodate a family of 13. Um, it's possible, but some of that occupancy criteria is subject to local jurisdiction, so
Mhm.
it's hard to say with certainty. But again, the model is really focused on housing, workforce.
Mhm.
Um, Go ahead.
Tim, I think maybe next time one of the things we could talk about is an idea that you and I have been chatting about, and that would be how to create equity, how to create wealth and equity through apartments, through housing in areas that traditionally were not available to other people.
Well, we've already touched on that today, and we touched on that in our first live event, and I'd be happy to really dial in to that conversation. I think for anybody who would be interested in that topic, there's a great book out there called The Color of Law.
Mhm.
That it's a great history, a comprehensive history of how American government
Mhm.
and American law precluded people of color from participating in the housing market, and in turn, precluded them from the wealth generation that
That's
comes
right.
along with how our housing markets how they function today.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that would be a great topic for future conversations.
Perfect. Okay. So I am going to read our, kind of our outgoing statement here about health. But Tim, as always, like, so good to talk to you all the time.
Yep.
Just enjoy our conversations about housing and look forward to more. To learn more about our initiatives, programs, services, and the ways to give, or if you're looking for medical care, please visit providence.org and make sure that you follow us on social media. Providence Health System for LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and Providence on Twitter. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.